Today we're going to be looking at the very curious note in Mark 6:3 that Jesus is, well, what is he? That's the question we'll start off with momentarily. It's translated carpenter, but we'll have quite a bit to say about that translation, and then we will move on to think through the implications of Jesus being whatever it is he turns out to have been. And then we will have our panel, craftspeople of different sorts. We pick up the action in Mark chapter 6. It says, Jesus left there and went to his hometown accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. As he comes to his hometown, back to where he went to high school, where he hung out at Nazareth House of Pizza or wherever they hung out, and then all of a sudden he's doing these astounding things and acting as if he's somebody. And if you've ever stayed in your hometown or been back to your hometown, there's this kind of proverbial Russian mentality that the highest grade of blade of grass is the one that gets chopped down, that they want to kind of bring you down to size to remember where you came from. And that's what's driving this dynamic. They're not denying that he's done miracles. They can't really deny that he's speaking wisely and insightfully into all sorts of things, but they just can't make the jump from, again, the kid they went to high school with to this whatever he thinks he is, right? Jesus has kept his messianic credentials a bit on the down low, but they sort of peek out every so often, and people are rightly getting the idea that he is more than he appears. So in the midst of this, we have what's almost a throwaway line in verse 3. Isn't this the carpenter? I'm actually going to teach you a little bit of Greek. Techtone. It sounds like some late night amazing product to seal your car or your kitchen counters. Techtone, now with chronomium. Who knows? But Techtone, you kind of get the tech word in there. It can be translated a variety of ways, and carpenter's not even necessarily the most likely. I think probably most scholars nowadays might lean a little bit towards something like a stonemason. And the reason is that this is kind of an all-purpose word for an artisan or a craftsperson. So if you look back in the Old Testament, in fact, you usually have to put a word after it to figure out exactly what sort of craftsman view. So if you're talking about a carpenter, then you say a techtone of wood. Or it could equally be somebody who works in brass, assuming this is at least a brass-like substance. You'd say a techtone of brass. So we don't really know exactly what sort of a craftsman he was, but we do know that he was a craftsman. This is really about all we get by way of information in the Gospels. Matthew says he's the son of a techtone, right, which doesn't really advance the discussion much because A, it's the same word, and B, it just shows he's the son. And of course, in those days, you typically did what your father did anyway professionally. There wasn't a lot of career advancement. The guidance counselor at Nazareth High would just sit there in an empty office because there's really nothing much that she could say to direct them. Well, what's your dad do? Every conversation would start and end the same. Well, I think there's a lot of room there in fishing, Peter. We'll get this one little reference along with the thing in Matthew, and that's all. And this really can shoot us off into two very different kinds of directions. And I think both of these things happen, and I'm not thrilled with either option, so I'm going to try to suggest a third thing. So first of all, you say, this is just one throwaway line. Jesus' job as a craftsman was clearly not central to who he is. That his real job is to be king of Israel, king of the world, king of the cosmos. And then we start to diminish then the value of his having been a carpenter. This is one of these things he sloughs aside. And once that's your on-ramp into that whole theology that we've been fighting against for the last several weeks that says spiritual work is important, physical manual labor is unimportant, right? This is godly, this is secular, this is holy, this is defiled. Have a whole way of looking at the world, which hopefully you don't embrace that wholeheartedly, but somewhere in the back of your head you have that sense that there's a difference between those two things, and the difference is good versus bad, not just this versus that. The fact that this is only mentioned as a throwaway line shows that it's fundamentally unimportant, that what we do in the world is fundamentally unimportant, and all that matters is the kind of spiritual, eternal realm that Jesus is going to lead us away from our everyday pursuits into some higher realm. I don't think that's the way the Bible as a whole sets out life, and I don't think that's the significance of Jesus just quickly being alluded to as a Techtone. The other way is this. Jesus is a carpenter. That's all we have, but that's all we need, because now we just turn on our theological, pious imagination, and everything Jesus does, and since we're thinking about him being a carpenter right now, is suffused with a literal and figurative halo of awesomeness. So that when Jesus is learning how to be a carpenter, Joseph is holding his hand steadily as the Holy Family gathers around the plank or the stone wall to be made. And Jesus, of course, he does everything perfectly, and he looks up at Mom and Dad, and they glow right back at him, and it's just so awesome. And every day Jesus goes off to work with a fine attitude, and his fellows are there by his side. And again, it's just every stone he touches is perfect, and every plank he saws is just as straight as can be. Everything fits, and his work is holy, just like your work is holy. This kind of pious vision with the gauze lens and the bright lights attending everything Jesus does, that can be equally devastating for your work, because, I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe it's just the fact it's 15 degrees outside in the middle of March, and I'm a little bitter inside and out. But that doesn't really feel like the way I go about my work on a day-to-day basis. Right? It's not all just halos and sunshine and angelic choirs attending the least little bit of perfect work that I always do. Right? Things go wrong half the time. Right? And we're leaving aside when I actually dip into the realm of practical matters, which is basically a slow-moving disaster movie every time it happens. Things go wrong. Things go wrong on the job. We go wrong on the job, right? So when we think of Jesus just being perfect in his work, and that for him somehow stonemasonry or carpentry becomes this magical spiritual experience, that could be almost as crushing as the prior false way. And so I want to steer clear between them, those two options, although more perhaps towards this idea that I want to see the extraordinary nature of the fact that Jesus is a carpenter wrapped up in the fact of his very ordinary labor. That I don't think everything he did was so suffused in this holiness that everyone around him was just suddenly magically happy and it was all beautiful and perfect. I just can't imagine that's in fact how it went down. Jesus did not live in Bible land. Right? Bible land, this mythical world composed out of flannel-graph where everyone's really, really good or really, really bad. Yeah? It's not a magical place. He lived in our world, and he worked a job like many of you work. He knows what it is to work an ordinary job day by day with irritating people around him, with stuff that doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. And the fact that the eternal God, the Messiah of Israel, creator of the cosmos, as we learned a couple weeks ago, that he would participate in everyday ordinary work, that to me is the most extraordinary thing of all, and that frankly is the most encouraging thing.
Hi, I'm Jim Hickey, and I am a landscape designer, contractor. I started working for a lady in Beverly Farms doing landscape maintenance, and it was So cathartic for me. I really enjoyed being outdoors. I loved working with my hands. And, it wasn't like this big light bulb going on. I didn't realize like this was a point in my path that was kind of guiding my career. But through kind of a circuitous path that God took me on, I ended up doing landscape design even before I was really trained to do it.
I'm Linda Coonrod. I run a custom drapery workroom. I got into this because I wasn't getting the teaching job I wanted to get, and then the drapery business took off.
Going into that, were you clever with your hands? Did you enjoy this sort
Oh,
of
you mean,
thing?
did I know how to sew before I started?
Yeah. The truth can now be told, right?
Well, I did. I mean, I'd sewn since,
Yeah.
home ec class but I will tell you that when that home ec teacher years later saw that I had a custom drapery business, she laughed because I was not real good when I started.
So your call, and it sounds like you could describe it as a calling, what you're doing,
I really feel like it was.
is not a simple thing where it's just God spoke out of heaven and said, Linda, you were to do drapery. It's a convergence of all sorts of things that land you where you were. And then in retrospect, you look back and say, oh my goodness, God's hand has been in that. And even then it's been in a remarkable number of different angles.
So I'm Alden Drake, and for 20 years I worked as a city planner in Lynn, Massachusetts. In the late 1980s, many of you remember, there was a big big stock market crash in October of 1987. A lot of jobs left Massachusetts, and blue-collar cities like Lynn suffered tremendously. Loss of population, loss of jobs. So there were a lot of vacant buildings, and then vacant buildings became blighted and eyesores, and a place where things happen that you don't want happening in your neighborhood. It was my job to manage and really basically perform triage, and I took over 7 rooming houses with almost 300 SRO, single room occupancy units, and I wrote the relocation plan. I implemented the relocation plan. I implemented the rehabilitation, and I learned that those are God's people too. They're just low wage, low skill, many of them with emotional or psychological issues that limited their potential, and they needed a clean place, a clean, safe, affordable place to live. So I feel that was a real wonderful opportunity, and I learned a lot. The Lord taught me a lot, and it turned out very well.
A lot of my work has been a lot of interpersonal contact with people in their homes. You're in their home, you're discussing what their lifestyle is all about, and just kind of almost like a lifestyle evangelism kind of thing. Because you're doing this kind of a business, people expect, well, surely I can just pay you cash and you won't have to declare this. I'm sorry, no, I'm still going to declare it. I mean, there was just this whole idea that people were going to think you're going to be hiding the money under the table. This is the sort of the general expectation in this kind of service. And it's like, no, this is not the way I operate. I can remember one of our earliest clients, we had a little shop in town that was a decorating shop that we did a lot of work for. They started calling my sister and I the Sunday school teachers. I mean, we hadn't made any context about discussing, but this was just the way people perceived us, that we were living our lives in a little different way than the rest of them, and that we were and I'm hoping that what that was, that there was some integrity in the way that we presented ourselves to people.